When you take a look at this historic building, nothing appears to be untoward. This is the royal Palace of Abomey in the West African country of Benin, and you may think of it as a historical curiosity like any other palace in Europe or Asia. But within these walls is contained the dark secrets of an empire. Once considered fantasy or legend, the pioneering techniques of modern science have revealed that this was in fact a sinister reality. As within the walls of one of the buildings, it wasn't just clay and mortar that was used to build the walls, it was laced with human blood. And not just one person, but dozens of people. Far from being a one-off action of a small group of people, this mass human sacrifice was a deeply rooted religious practice carried out for centuries and sacred to a formidable kingdom and its ruler, who for him, blood was more than violence, it was power. It was authority, and it was divine. Now, the palace where these blood rituals took place was the Kingdom of Dahomey. This was no backwater tribe. Between the 1600s to the late 1800s, this was one of the most organized and feared powers in West Africa. Dominated by the Fon ethnic group, the kings of Dahomey ruled over one of the most militaristic societies in pre-colonial Africa. The kingdom was home to the famous Dahomey Amazons, or Agoji, an all-female group of warriors who have become well known in modern popular culture. The kingdom thrived through constant conquest and raiding. In fact, it was so central to the political authority of the king that he derived much of his legitimacy from his ability to conquer territory and particularly to capture slaves. Although little discussed in North America and Europe, Dahomey was one of the major players in the Atlantic slave trade. It was one of the most active African kingdoms involved in the capture, selling and exporting of African slaves to the Americas. In Dahomey, a king didn't just rule by bloodline, he ruled by bloodshed. He was expected to derive much of his legitimacy from his ability to conduct military campaigns, whether this was conquest or perhaps more importantly, capturing of slaves. Dahomey turned war into commerce and captives into currency, becoming one of the wealthiest and most feared kingdoms in West Africa by selling their enemies to the world. But those captured weren't just to be sold into slavery. As if that wasn't bad enough, the ones who remained in Africa served a more nefarious purpose. They were used for the grisly practice of human sacrifice, which was inextricably linked to the political and spiritual authority of Dahomey's kings. And this is perhaps what separates human sacrifice in Dahomey to other practices in Africa which horrified the Western world. This one was a royal affair, which brings us back to the discovery in the present day at the Palace of the King of Dahomey. In a joint effort involving researchers from France and Benin, a team of archaeologists and biochemists collected microscopic samples from the walls of what is thought to be a funerary hut, which was built to honour the father of the famous 19th century King Gezo. To uncover the truth of the historic rumours, they turned to a cutting-edge technique known as paleoproteomics, the study of ancient proteins preserved in archaeological materials. Now, unlike DNA, which often degrades rapidly, especially in the warm climate of West Africa, proteins can survive for centuries. By extracting and analysing proteins trapped within the clay, scientists looked for biological signatures that could reveal exactly what had been mixed into the building's walls. And the results were chilling. Hemoglobin, the iron-rich protein that gives blood its colour and carries oxygen through our veins, was detected. As was trace levels of serum albumin, another blood protein, confirming that the builders of this structure didn't just spill blood upon it, but they mixed human blood into the clay itself. But the scientific analysis revealed something even stranger. Of the blood that was discovered, not all of it was human. Proteins consistent with chicken blood were also found in the structure. And this is because of the wider theological context of the historic Kingdom of Dahomey, as the sacrifice of humans and chickens was an important religious practice within the Vodun tradition, often called voodoo in common parlance. And in the cosmology of voodoo, blood as a physical substance is not horror, it is power. It's a life force, a medium through which humans can communicate with the spirits and the souls of their departed kings. The chickens had a particular purpose. In voodoo tradition, they are the ones who are the messengers between humans and the spirits. Their job was to open the door to the divine, which when the more serious sacrifices, the human ones, would seal the covenant. And it's important to remember that for Dahomey, the ritual sacrifice of humans wasn't some wanton act of cruelty or sadism. For them it was a powerful act of faith which allowed them to venerate their sacred ancestors. Now this religious devotion was no low-key affair. The ceremony itself where sacrifices took place was one of the most spectacular and feared events in the entire kingdom. It was known as the annual customs of Dahomey, or as one British observer described, the watering of the graves. For several days and sometimes weeks, the royal city of Abomey became the stage for this grand and sacred spectacle. Envoys, soldiers and commoners from across the land flooded in for the scene. Tribute caravans would arrive, slaves captured in war, cattle, cloth, ivory, palm oil, and firearms from coastal trade with Europeans. The king's army took part in the parade as a visible symbol of Dahomey's military prowess. The victims themselves met a sorry end. Some were beheaded in a single stroke, others were slain with swords and clubs, with their spilled blood being crucial to this most brutal of voodoo practices. Although exact numbers are hard to ascertain, historical records speak of dozens, sometimes hundreds of captives being sacrificed during the annual customs, with the days-long ceremonies becoming an unbroken cycle of pageantry, tribute, and ritual death. And there were a whole host of other reasons that sacrifices might take place, including military conquests and great victories of the kingdom. Over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, there are multiple accounts from British travellers to Dahomey of this very practice taking place. In 1727, a British trader, William Snelgrave, saw the aftermath of Dahomey's great conquest of a rival African kingdom, the Kingdom of Whydah. He writes how he was shown two large stages, upon which were heaped large numbers of human heads, and he was told by his interpreter that these were 4,000 Whydah captives who had just been sacrificed to honour the great conquest that Dahomey had carried out. Whilst this number is almost certainly an exaggeration, the practice of executing war captives through human sacrifice is well attested to. And being the centre of religious and spiritual authority in the kingdom, the death of a king or the coronation of a new one also necessitated human sacrifice. The great British explorer Richard Burton discusses what was known as the grand customs of Dahomey, similar yet notably different to the annual ones. He describes a second-hand account from the coronation of a new king in 1791, where for a full 3 months, almost every day was marked with the spilling of human blood, and in total, 500 men, women and children were killed in this time, describing them as victims to revenge and ostentation under the show of piety. All these practices of human sacrifice could not have been more alien to Western sensibilities, and when reports of these deeds reached European ears, quite often the response was utter revulsion. The European Christian mind of the 18th and 19th centuries, the taking of life in a ritual context was the ultimate violation of God's law, "Thou shalt not kill." In Britain, reports from traders, missionaries and naval officers sparked a fiery condemnation in Parliament. In 1860, Lord Fermoy, when speaking to the House of Lords, woefully lamented that great sacrifices were to take place as part of the grand customs in honour of the late King Gezo. He described the great pits that had been dug, which is to contain human blood enough to float a canoe. He implored Parliament to take measures to prevent, as he describes, this awful sacrifice, and insisted that no time should be lost impressing upon the King of Dahomey that, quote, this frightful custom should be abandoned entirely. With similar invective, in 1865 the French publication Le Moniteur Universel published a letter describing the sacrifices as a barbarous deed. The exact nature and practice of the sacrifice was laid out in great detail in what they described as monstrous scenes. But perhaps the most well-known case of moral abhorrence at Dahomey's human sacrifices comes from the Royal Naval Officer Frederick E. Forbes, the man who not only witnessed the sacrifices himself, but managed to rescue one of its victims. Forbes visited Dahomey in 1850 as part of the British diplomatic mission in order to convince the great King Gezo to give up his participation in the slave trade voluntarily. As King Gezo's guest, Forbes witnessed the annual watering of the graves and saw, to his utter disgust, people thrown into pits and beheaded as part of the sacrifices. In his writings, Forbes doesn't hide behind diplomatic niceties. He describes the act as nothing but murder and calls Gezo a barbarous tyrant and invokes his Christian principles, saying, "May God forgive them in the world to come." Forbes summarized his moral judgment of the whole affair by saying, quote, he was disgusted beyond the powers of description, and he was particularly horrified by the delight that the Dahomeyan spectators took in the murder of innocent people. Forbes and his companion did not stand idly by. They pleaded with the king, even offering him money in exchange for the lives of some of the victims, and one of them was a young girl who Forbes concluded was of high-born status. Remarkably, King Gezo agreed to let her go. Forbes renamed the girl Sarah Forbes Bonetta after both himself and his ship, HMS Bonetta. He took her back to Great Britain with him and presented her to Queen Victoria, and in a remarkable turnaround, the girl who was almost a human sacrifice ended up becoming the goddaughter of Queen Victoria. Victoria went on to pay for her education, sending her to the prestigious Cheltenham Ladies' College. For men like Forbes and the other critics, Dahomey's sacrifices were the very embodiment of barbarity and pagan darkness in Africa. It was a confrontation not just between nations, but between distinctive worldviews, one steeped in ancestral rites and the other in the absolute sanctity of life under a Christian God. On his analysis of the practice, Richard Burton perceptively commented that to abolish human sacrifice here is to abolish Dahomey. He realized the centrality of the practice to the kingdom and what was necessary to remove it. His words would prove to be prophetic, as when human sacrifice was eventually eradicated, so was the kingdom itself. By the closing years of the 19th century, the Kingdom of Dahomey stood at a crossroads. For centuries, its kings had ruled by the sword and by the altar, their authority cemented in blood. But beyond West Africa, the world had changed, and that change was coming for Dahomey. By this point in time, the scramble for Africa had begun. The European powers, with their economic, military and technological superiority, were carving up the continent between them, and the existing African polities were in no position to stop them. The Third French Republic, with its ambitions for empire, had already claimed neighbouring territories, and soon Dahomey's independence was in its sights. In a story that was typical of conflicts in colonial Africa, in the 1890s, the French clashed with the Kingdom of Dahomey. And armed with repeating rifles, artillery and gunboats, the French were able to soundly defeat the warriors who had terrorized West Africa for centuries. Despite fierce resistance, the casualty counts were extremely lopsided in favour of the French, and only a few thousand soldiers were needed to carry out these campaigns. In November 1892, the French triumphantly entered the capital of Abomey, and by 1894, a treaty was signed, and the Kingdom of Dahomey itself was consigned to history. Modernity had truly arrived, and French colonization caused sweeping changes to the cultural and political landscape. Colonial authorities, steeped in the moral codes of the 19th century and driven by the civilizing mission, could never tolerate human sacrifice under their watch. When the French successfully captured the capital, almost immediately, the military commander in charge of the campaign, a man named Alfred Amédée Dodds, gave a speech where he declared that all enslavement, human sacrifice and the festivities around it were now over. And he also declared that the monarch that these barbarous ceremonies were inextricably linked to was now deposed. The old rhythms of the kingdom, with the drums, the chants and the ceremonies of death, all fell silent with the French tricolour flying above the royal palace. And so it came to be that human sacrifice in Dahomey was abolished, not through gradual change, but a direct imposition brought about by foreign conquest. The new era the French had ushered in saw not only the end of sacrifices, but also the social order that upheld it, both of which were completely abhorrent to Dahomey's new European masters. A huge thank you goes to my Patreon supporters. Their names are on the screen right now. If you'd like to join them, there is a link in the description below. Please like, subscribe, comment below, tell me what you thought about the video. Did you learn something new? Did you find it interesting? I hope to be making more videos soon, perhaps on a less morbid subject than human sacrifice, but you'll have to wait and see. So until then, I'll see you on the next one.